2016 was a great year for video games. We're finally getting those games that really take advantage of modern hardware, and the difference between those games and the games we were getting just a few years ago is dramatic. That plus a always thriving indie scene have made this year a joy to play video games in. But today we're not here to talk about the bounty of wonderful games we got this year, the countless numbers. Today, I'm here to tell you my top 10 games of the year. The 10 games that I personally enjoyed most this year. So let's get started. Every other year, Playground Games puts out a Forza game I'm actually interested in playing. The period of time where the stock Forza or Gran Turismo games interested me has long passed, with their ridiculously repetitive structures, but I do still enjoy playing the occasional racing game with at least a few sim elements. And for me, the Horizon games have always managed to nail the balance between arcade racing and simulation racing in a way that nothing else has. Even more importantly, the changes they keep making with each successive iteration are for the positive. This year's edition of more event choices than ever before, even allowing you to make your own events as you progress through the game, was a very welcome change, as were the rather substantive additions to multiplayer. But really, I wanted more Horizon, more great racing with excellent controls and a beautiful environment. And this game delivered all of that in spades. All the way back to the release of the original Amnesia, most first-person games where you don't have a gun have a tendency to be rather lonely affairs. You're either told the story through audio logs or diaries or some other sort of archived storytelling mechanic. You never meet another person or even really talk to one. Now, I know that telling a story about a group of characters, especially in video games, can be quite difficult to do well. There's a lot of things to consider, and if you want to hone in on a theme or something very specific, all that dialogue can be distracting. But Firewatch does something really smart on a few different levels. For one, it does have you directly interact with a person, but just that one single person. Then they chose to make the game about that one relationship. Even though you don't see the person on the other end of your walkie-talkie, you feel intimately connected with them. This dialogue you're going through while exploring these beautiful wilderness environments is extremely well written and really explores this one relationship in depth. And very important to that exploration is the fact that the player character has never actually spoke to the other person before the game started, meaning that you, as the player, dictate the entire course of the relationship. There have been plenty of games that have aspired to do something like this, but none of them have really nailed it, until Firewatch. When I first played the original Superhot prototype, I was quite impressed. Creating something new in the world of first-person shooters is an extremely difficult thing to do as a AAA studio, but seeing an indie experimenting with the genre in a very intriguing way was quite encouraging. But that's all I really expected to come of the whole thing. A neat experiment that might have its mechanics incorporated into another bigger game somewhere down the road. Instead, we got a fully fledged, extremely polished version of the original concept, and it did not disappoint. The time manipulation mechanic that was the heart of the prototype was vastly expanded, with a heavy focus on the puzzle aspects, and I felt quite challenged a lot of the times, which is not something I would usually associate with the vast majority of shooters. And it did that without getting rid of the sort of pulse-pounding action I kind of expect from a shooter. You're tossing your weapon away, grabbing another one, shooting somebody, grabbing their gun. It's all so fluid and well done, and it's not only strategic, but it feels like you're a real badass. I definitely do wish there was more of it, but what's here is so fresh and well done that it absolutely gets a spot on my top 10. Uncharted 4 isn't really a game that I thought I wanted. The best parts of Uncharted games for me have always been their expertise in storytelling. Sometimes they can lean a little bit too much on their existing archetypes or stories that have been done a million times already, but the production values by which they create those stories inside the constraints of a video game have always been extremely impressive. The problem for me personally was that I had felt like Uncharted 3 had wrapped up the story quite nicely. It felt like a suitable conclusion to a trilogy, and I felt like it would be best left at that. But in that way especially, the latest entry in the Uncharted series really surprised me. It still has the wide-ranging treasure hunting theme, but in this game, that almost entirely takes a back seat to a story about family. Both the parts of our family we get to choose and those we don't. The relationship between Drake and Elena is particularly well written and is probably one of the best depictions I've ever seen of marital problems just about anywhere. All that said, this game is also very much still Uncharted when it comes to gameplay, and is honestly starting to get a bit tired. While Uncharted 4's story was excellent enough to manage to carry the game through, I sincerely hope that if they make another one, they do something to shake up how it plays. Stories in games have come a very long way from where they started, which is to say basically non-existent. But one of the biggest problems they still have is conversation. Simulation of actual realistic human conversation is difficult, to say the least. In the course of a regular conversation, there are all sorts of interruptions and pauses and back and forth that never really seem to be represented in the medium, even in games that are extremely focused on their stories and their conversations, like Mass Effect. But Oxenfree brings with it the most natural conversation system I've ever seen in a game. It dedicates the face buttons to conversation options, not only allowing you to still move around in the environment while talking, but also giving you the choice to interrupt whenever you want. And then the game will actually try and naturally transition into the conversation that was happening before you so rudely interrupted. And for the most part, it works, although the timing can be a bit unwieldy and difficult to pull off. Oxenfree's actual story isn't particularly great, it's relatively generic, but its character interactions are top-notch, some of the best I have ever seen in a video game. And I really do hope that other developers pick up this conversation system and implement it in their own games. I'm not entirely sure there's anything to say about Overwatch that hasn't already been said by so many others at this point. Blizzard took the remains of their failed MMO project and they turned it into not just an incredible team-based multiplayer experience, but also made it into a cultural phenomenon within the video game space. And in some ways, that's not surprising. Just about every one of Blizzard's franchises has a rabid fan following. But Overwatch is surprising in that Blizzard was once again wandering into uncharted territory. Sure, they've done the same recently with Heroes of the Storm and Hearthstone, but first-person shooters, especially ones as intricate as Overwatch, require an intimate knowledge of design and balancing to pull off in a way that works well. And for a studio like Blizzard, who's never made a shooter before, to make one as well made as Overwatch is nothing short of incredible. But despite all the hurdles, Blizzard has not only made a game that is one of the best of the year, but it's one that I feel will end up being a modern classic when all is said and done. The first Dishonored is one of my favorite games in the last decade or so. Incredible level design, well-crafted stealth mechanics, an enormous toolbox full of abilities, and the flexibility to achieve the game's objectives in so many different ways, even 100% non-lethally if you so desired, helped make it the spiritual successor to Thief in my mind. And in just about every single one of those arenas, Dishonored 2 improves on the things that the first game did, without destroying any of them. Dishonored 2 feels like a sequel should, an expansion of ideas from the previous game in smart and in-depth ways without ruining what made that original game so great. Levels are even more intricate, the toolbox full of abilities is even bigger, split between two different playable characters, and the stealth is more varied and challenging. It does still have a variety of issues, most of which almost always come along with a game that gives you this level of freedom. But what I go into these sorts of games for is to see the interwoven systems at work. On some level, I want to see the flaws, but more importantly, I'm willing to overlook them in order to fully enjoy one of the best stealth games I've ever played. The first Titanfall was all about movement. It was the first of the wave of futuristic shooters that made movement a huge part of shooter design again, and Titanfall 2 certainly expands on the ideas that its predecessor had in the multiplayer arena, adding new modes and new gameplay features, but most importantly, adding a ton of new progression options. I loved the first Titanfall. I thought it played great. The fluid movement was unlike any other game on the market at the time. But it also had a terrible progression system. The number of weapons and gadgets available to the player were abysmally low, and it didn't take long for you to get to a level where new unlocks weren't interesting anymore. And Titanfall 2 definitely fixes that with a ton of new titans, weapons, and other assorted kit. Once you combine that with the improved movement and shooting, you have one of the year's best multiplayer shooters, and my personal favorite. But that's not where it ends. Because this time around, Respawn decided to tackle the single-player campaign, something that they more or less completely avoided with the first game. And while Titanfall 2's story feels disjointed and imperfect, it does have a ton of great ideas. It reminds me a lot of Half-Life 2 in that way. I wasn't given particularly great reasons for why I was doing things, but I loved the highly experimental and interesting things that I was doing. While each of Titanfall 2's halves might be weaker than other games on my list, together they make Titanfall 2 probably the most well-rounded shooter this year. But there is one game that executed on the single-player aspect of the shooter far better than any other game this year: Doom. Shooters have changed a lot since the release of the original Doom. They've changed to an extent where it's hard to think you could still make a game like the original Doom. So when id finally started talking about this latest installation in their series that had been rumored to be in development forever, I kind of dismissed it out of hand, especially after I considered the company's most recent efforts up to that point. But not only did Doom shock me by being a good game, it also shocked me by being so fundamentally old school in nature. Doom has a rhythm to it, a pulse, that once you play enough of it, you become completely tuned into, chaining together combos in a way not unlike hack-and-slash games, shooting and executing your way through hordes of hellspawn. Going back to capture footage for this list, all I really wanted to do was keep playing it. Mechanically speaking, it feels better than any other game this year. Everything just flows in a way that you would expect from older, tighter shooters. Even the game's weak and generic story somehow goes perfectly with the action movie vibe the whole game has, though the game itself is perfectly willing to tell you exactly how much attention it thinks you should be paying to its story. But Doom's gameplay is probably the tightest, most well-refined experience I had all year. It may not be doing anything new or particularly revolutionary in the genre, but it is doing a lot of things that haven't been done well in a very long time. But while Doom was the tightest, most well-refined experience I had this year, I had more fun elsewhere. Now, I don't usually stick to a single game for all that long, with the exception of a handful of multiplayer-focused titles. I like some variety. I enjoy playing the latest games however I can afford to get them, whether that's renting or borrowing. I like to keep things fresh. But this year, one game I found myself going back to over and over and over again all year long was Hitman. I think everyone had their doubts before this game came out. I know I certainly did. I couldn't imagine that an episodic Hitman game was going to come together and work well. Personally, I felt like it was a really bad sign for the overall quality of the entire production when they first announced it. But I could not have been more wrong. Hitman is everything I could have hoped for mechanically, a brilliant return to the open, unrestricted nature of its predecessors, with even more options and choice in your method of assassination than ever before. But not only is Hitman a very strong return to the franchise's greatest strengths after the relatively abysmal Absolution, but the episodic format with its consistent, on-time introduction of new levels, as well as limited-time elusive targets, and relentlessly difficult escalation contracts actually got me to play way more of the game than I usually would have. I was compelled to max out my mastery level for each and every mission, and because there was no new mission to play yet, I didn't feel like I had to make my way to the game's ending. The episodic nature of Hitman gave me more time to savor, to enjoy each individual level. Now, not all the maps in Hitman are gold, and while some of the optional mechanical additions do make the game a bit easier than I might personally like, as a whole package, the 2016 Hitman is not only a return to form for the series, but it is the perfect demonstration that the episodic model can not only work, but actively make a game more enjoyable than it would have been if it had been released all at once.